All right, so now we're on to the third part of this unit. In particular, this is the labor and government regulation side of things. So we already went over a very general first section of this unit. Then the second part was about robber barons and how basically wealth was accumulated and consolidated into very few people who were extremely wealthy, billionaires at the time, and they basically controlled everything. This is a reaction to that. So this industrialization, this extreme level of wealth being produced, and the people who weren't experiencing the wealth being increased are the little guys, and this is kind of a reaction to it. So first things first, here's our goal. Goal one, to assess the impact of labor unions on industry and the lives of workers within industry. Now, for the most part, we're talking about city centers because that's where most industry was located. So most of these movements, like union movements, labor law, progressive labor laws, child labor laws, they kind of happen in cities for the most part because that's where most of the industry was located. All right, so this is a very famous banner from the time. This was a artist rendition of an actual banner that existed. It was calling for an 8-hour workday. Now, nowadays, we don't really think much about the 8-hour workday. 8-hour workday would be 40 hours a week, 5 days out of the week. 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day for 5 days. That's what we now consider a typical full-time work week. But back then, you're talking about people working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, except maybe Sundays, depending on where you were located. So this is the whole idea: 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours of rest. And this was the movement at the time just to get an 8-hour workday set. All right, so working during the industrial age, wages were low. It's typical when you have a very dense populated area. It means you have an excess of population compared to the job. So because there were so many people and only so many jobs, manufacturers, management, bosses, whoever, they could lower the wages and say, well, I'll pay you $2 an hour or $1 an hour or 50 cents an hour because somebody else will work for 10 cents less an hour. And kept the wages down, which meant profits were up because they were selling the stuff for the same prices because they were keeping the wages down to reduce costs. As a result of this, you start seeing the rise of labor unions. Now, working conditions were awful. They were loud, noisy. It's notorious for people who lived during this time and worked in these factories. They couldn't hear in their later years simply because the factory work was so loud. Nothing was muffled. They'd be right next to a machine that just clanged all day long. It was just so terribly loud. Work conditions are also terribly dangerous, and you're about to see some images of just what the working conditions look like. Thousands of workers each year would die. This was not uncommon. Even that's just death. We're also maiming, people losing fingers, hands, sometimes arms in various areas of labor, building skyscrapers, working in factories with exposed belts and everything else working through it. It's just a nightmare waiting to happen. And then finally, child labor was extensively used. And in part, it's sad just by itself that child labor was used. We think child labor nowadays is like a 15-year-old working as a busboy at a restaurant. That's the closest thing we get to child labor. We're talking about 10-year-olds, guys, or younger, working in these factories, just trying to make money for their families. And there's an example of some child labor. They're working obviously in a textile mill, basically managing the thread, replacing it. These kids are no more than 10 years old. So you're talking about very young kids. And if you take a look right here, this belt is moving extremely fast. If your finger or your toe, well, this kid's not even wearing shoes, gets caught up in there, it's gone. It's not coming back, or it'll maim them for life, or it could potentially kill them. A small child getting wrapped up in this, it could snap them up and just kill them right there. And that was not terribly uncommon. It was a terrible, terrible time in history to be a poor kid in the city, because this is what you were going to be doing. Like, education wasn't required. There was no mandate to be educated as a young person. There was no required or compulsory school. You basically went to work when you were able because your family wouldn't eat otherwise. Here's a little girl in the same style of a textile mill just looking outside. God knows what she's looking at. Maybe other kids playing. Just a sad, sad situation. And notice here, look at all up and down this textile mill line. There's no adults. What kind of supervision? That might be an adult way off in the corner. But he'd be managing dozens of kids. And guess what? Kids don't have a lot of experience or good judgment. They might make a mistake that an adult wouldn't make. And here's the other really scary part. This is one of the nicer facilities to work in. There were some places where they hired children to go clean out machinery or unclog it or uncrunch it because it got jammed up. Not because they were desperate for somebody to do it, but because they'd fit inside the machinery because they were small. And it was notorious that kids would unclog something and the machine would go and then they get crushed. It was just a terrible, terrible time in history. because there were just no labor laws in place that were effective at basically taking care of workers or preventing child workers from being put in these dangerous situations. And guys, when we think about the noise, these pictures are obviously silent because they're pictures, but it would just be constant. These, even though they're just spooling thread or making fabric, this would just be like clang, clang, clang all day long. It would just be horrible, horrible noises you hear all day long. And there's no, the ventilation's poor. I mean, she can't even see over the machines to see if something bad's happening. If there were a fire, she'd be the last to know. She's too short to see it. She'd smell the smoke, and by then it's too late. Here are some kids. They're all these are all just factory working kids. They're covered in soot because they're working. This is probably a mine or a factory nearby where they're just covered in dirt and soot from working the full day. They don't get to live lives the way we think that kids today should live lives. You got this one kid over here. He's happy for some reason. But for the most part, these kids, they're working the way adults work. They're working the hours that adults work. They're working jobs that adults sometimes just can't because they're too big. They're taking on more dangerous roles than adults are sometimes. And the same with the young ladies. They're working in very similar positions. Now this kid's doing the safest job. He's hawking newspapers like the extra, read all about. He's kind of that kid. He's selling newspapers to people who can afford them, which would tend to be wealthier people, to make money for his family. Those are kids working in a coal mine. They're a little older, but they're still kids. They're working in a coal mine, black lung, all the terrible stuff. There's no regulation, no ventilation. They're just going down there with a lunch pail, and they hope they make it back up the next day. They work on the railroads. It affected everybody of every race, so keep that in mind. A lot of these textile mills, they'd be located in the South simply because that's where the cotton's being produced, and they put the factory on a river, or they'd be operating it by gas or oil power, and it was everywhere. Every major city in the South can probably be located near a river with a textile mill. Rocky Mount Textiles was a big deal for a while. And this last one, this is just a advertisement. This is a progressive era advertisement saying, like, guys, why are we making our children do this? And it's pointing out what today is so obvious. Lad fell to death in a big coal chute. Basically, he walked down a coal mine and didn't see the hole and fell and died. They're not, basically pointing out, children are not experienced or equipped for modern industry. They don't have the judgment to look at something ahead of them and say, okay, that could hurt me. So kids were maimed. They'd lose arms. This kid on the left-hand side lost fingers. And the whole reason for this at the time was basically to keep wages low because kids will work for less money, and to make the factory safe cost extra, so they wouldn't do it because that would hurt the bottom line or the profit margin. And the bottom argument is, are any of these reasons, is greed, ignorance, employment of children, all that stuff, necessity, is all of that worth the kid's life? And the argument obviously is no. All right, guys, so we are now onto labor unions, and we need to talk about the formation of labor unions. So they stem from this whole idea that workers are being mistreated by the big bad bosses, which is essentially the reason why most labor unions are made. The original purpose is to increase wages from like the poverty level to something workable, and to better working conditions, and basically help with child labor laws, all these various ways. Basically, it was to give labor a voice in how they would be used as labor, whether it was at the national level or even the local level with local factories. So, negotiation. This is where workers and management would attempt to reach compromise agreements through discussion about working conditions, wages. Sometimes they will work. Sometimes it would work. You'd go in with your entire labor union, which would basically be all your employees, and say, hey, fix this because it's not safe, or fix this because we can't live on this low wage. And they'd be open, they'd negotiate, and they'd meet somewhere in the middle. But a large majority of the time, it just didn't work out. Like, management would be intransigent. They wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't change anything around because they thought they just had this labor ready to go. And again, you're talking about very overpopulated areas where there's extra people doing this labor. And most of this labor we're talking about is unskilled. We're not talking about people who are working as mechanics. We're talking about people who are like pressing a button or pressing a stamp or doing a basic stitch in a seamstress house, or working with machines that can be trained in an afternoon or in a week or so. So not very skilled, highly skilled labor. All right, so collective bargaining, these are the big negotiations between management and the union. So traditionally we started off with just general negotiations, and now we're into the collective bargaining portion of union work. So this is where the entire union, or a representative or a person who represents the whole union, comes together and says, all right, I'm negotiating on behalf of the whole union, which is most of your workers, and if you don't do what we say, we're all going to go on strike, and you won't make money because you won't have your labor force. Now, mediation, as you can imagine, most of these issues were kind of contentious. So you'd have one side, management, versus the labor on the other side. And they got very contentious, and sometimes people would just not negotiate and be angry about it, and then things would go bad. So mediation is a strategy where you bring in a third party that kind of says, okay, guys, let's talk about this. I'm neutral. I think you got some points. I think you got some points. Let's try to fix this in a more productive way. It basically takes a lot of the emotion out of it because you bring someone who's not really tied into the issue, like a third-party mediator. There's also, in certain public schools, use mediation when there's a conflict between students, where they have a peer mediator, somebody who's the same age, basically taking on the role of the mediator and trying to make sure everybody's working back and forth together. Now, here's the key thing. Most mediation, even today in law with lawsuits, is non-binding. So if the mediator says, all right, let's do this, they can just choose not to do it. Now, arbitrator, that's where the third-party involvement, there's actually a third-party involvement in settling the management and labor disputes. This is where there's already an issue going on. And arbitration looks a lot more like a court case. So it basically is a little more binding, and usually it's done by contract. The arbitrator basically serves the same purpose as a mediator. Usually a mediator doesn't make a decision. He just kind of tries to get the two parties to agree to something. And an arbitrator will actually make a choice. And they'll say, all right, management, you need to give up this. Labor, you need to give up this. We're done. And that'll be the decision. And again, typically it's not binding. All right, so on to types of unions. First, trade unions. These include many different kinds of skilled workers and unskilled. So the non-skilled layer would be something just like a laborer coming in to work on a farm to clean up, sweep a floor, to do non-skilled work, just stuff that you can be trained to do very quickly. And then there's skilled laborers, people like bricklayers, or we call them masons, people who actually like know how to lay brick in a certain way that makes it stable and makes it beautiful, all that fun stuff. And then you have what's called craft unions. Craft unions are for skilled workers all in the same occupation. So a carpenter workers union, a communications worker union. There's a union for air traffic controllers nowadays. There's a printers union. There are teachers unions. They're basically people that are there in one certain skill, and they negotiate as a union together for that particular industry. There's fire and rescue unions. There's EMT unions. There's the Noble Brotherhood of Police. They're a union. There's lots of different kind of unions. There's a postal workers union. There's unions for every major industry, basically. All right, and then you got Samuel Gompers. He was the first leader of the AFL and AFL-CIO, and he strongly fought against socialism. So this is kind of weird. So the first union big-time leader for the American Federation of Laborers was anti-socialism. And that's usually the opposite contentions made. You got some cigar rollers here. They were a skilled union making cigars, especially in Cuba. Basically, you're talking about a guy who was anti-socialist but pro-labor. And if you know much about socialist doctrine, it is labor or the proletariat versus management, or also called the bourgeoisie under Marx's Communist Manifesto. The idea being that this guy's pro-labor, anti-socialism is kind of a oxymoron almost. It doesn't make any sense, but he was anti-socialism. He wanted capitalists to work, but he wanted workers to be treated fairly in the process. All right, so the American Federation of Labor focused on collective bargaining between workers and management to reach written agreements on wages and work hours. The union only allowed skilled workers and was led by Gompers. So this is specifically for skilled workers. They're not going to let somebody in whose only job it is to like sew one stitch at a seamstress factory or a textile mill, or to load on spools of thread, things that don't require skill. He's going to be dealing with construction workers, people who can do things like do communications work, skilled labor. All right, and the motto of the AFL-CIO now is work conquers everything. The idea that being, well, yeah, the big guys up top making all the money, yeah, they're making all the money, but they're doing it because of the workers. So if you stop working, that's your big thing right there. If labor conquers everything, you're good. That's what that means down there at the bottom. Labor conquers everything. And the base again was this 8-hour work day. This idea of having 8 hours of work. And if you don't meet our demands as laborers, who's going to do the labor for you? Nobody, because it's us or nobody else. And if you got enough people to become a member of these unions, there would be a great deal of power against the management groups, because they wouldn't have a choice. If 90% of your employees are unionized and 90% of employees go on strike, and you're a skilled labor operation, you can't find people to replace them because their labor is skilled. That's one of the reasons why the AFL is such a very strong labor union, is you can't have what's called a scab come in and replace them. Unskilled laborers, yeah, because it's not much skill involved, you can bring somebody in to replace them pretty quickly. But with the AFL, because they're all skilled laborers, there wasn't much choice for the management. If they stopped working, work didn't get done. All right, now you got a guy named Eugene Debs. He was a socialist. Now, where Gompers was a non-socialist. He was pro-capitalism, but also pro-union and labor. This guy was pro-union and labor, but he was a socialist. He believed in the socialist ideology. He actually ran for president from prison in 1920 because he was arrested for protesting during World War I. And you couldn't do that at the time because it was considered anti-American and could result in people not signing up and could hurt the war effort. But basically, this guy was actually able to run for president from prison. Didn't win, but he did run. All right, so strikes. Close shop. This is a labor agreement that forced the industry to hire union members. So if you were let's say you were in a steel mill and you had a union. If you had a closed shop, that would mean that the management could not hire anybody into the factory who wasn't a union member, and basically gave the union almost a monopoly over the employees. So the employees would have to be members of the union, otherwise they couldn't work there. So it means that they can go on strike more easily. Now, an actual strike is a work stoppage strategy used by unions to get management to agree to employee terms. This was huge during the 18th and 19th century. So you had all these people, even into the 20th century, people would go on strike on a regular basis. You hear about maids going on strike, the fast food workers strike, even though they're not in a union. The whole idea being that if we stop working, what are they going to do? They can't make money if there's no one to work the factories. So that's a way to get what you want, which is things like fair labor standards, higher pay wages, better treatment of children in the workforce, that kind of stuff. And then you have the people we talked about just briefly a second ago, scabs. Scabs were workers, typically in unskilled professions, who would cross the picket line and go to work. Now, the reason why we don't like that, like union workers didn't like scabs, is because you had enough scabs come in, they could just fire the union population and replace them with these scab workers. And guys, being a scab was not a fun thing. You got paid a lot of extra money because they needed the workers badly, because the union would put management in a tough position where they had to hire people. But to cross that picket line, you could have rocks thrown at you. People would spit on you. You might just get assaulted in general, beaten with clubs. They weren't really shy about being violent towards these scabs because they were undermining the union effort. So not a good thing, but it's just something was happening. You had to have some cojones to kind of want to cross that picket line, because there's about 1,000 men there ready to beat you with clubs, throw rocks at you, and mistreat you in general. And typically, you'd be from around the neighborhood. They knew who you were if you were a scab. All right, yellow dog contracts. These were an attempt by management to encourage strikers to cross the picket line. Laborers basically would contractually promise not to join unions while they were employed. I'm sorry, there's a dog there, it's in the way. But basically, here's the idea. Well, if we can get enough people not to join the union, then the union loses its power. So this is a management counteract. It's almost like the opposite of a closed shop. So a closed shop, you have to join the union to become an employee. Here, if you become part of a union, we won't employ you. So it's the opposite. It's a way to prevent unions from gaining too much power. And then you have a lockout tactic. This is used by management to discourage union growth. It basically prevents employees from coming to work. So if there's like whispers like, hey, let's unionize, guys, and management starts seeing that, they'll be like, all right, we're locking them out. We're not going to let them work. We're going to go. They're basically committing, like they're biting they're biting themselves in the thumb to save their whole body. They're basically hurting themselves. They're making less money for the sole purpose of reducing the power of those workers. Say, all right, they're thinking about unionizing. That would be bad for us. So we're going to basically put them on the street and have them make no money just for even talking about it. Or if they try to unionize, they'd say, all right, we're closing shop. We're not going to have you working here. And once the union rabble stopped working and they stopped wanting to unionize, and they wanted to feed their families and stuff, they'd open the shop back up and let you come in and work. But usually a yellow dog contract will be part of it, and you can't join a union. All right, the blacklist. A blacklist was, in the broad concept, is a list of people that is no longer allowed to engage in something. So during the Red Scare, communism was a big fear. So if you got associated with any kind of communist movement, you got blacklisted, especially in Hollywood. If you were an actor and they thought you might be a communist, boom, you're never working again. It was a list of union organizers in this context. It was circulated around management to prevent management from hiring unionists. So if you had ever joined a union, you might be on this blacklist, and let's say you live in Boston and then you move over to New York. That New York factory that you might want to get a job at might have a list with your name on it, and boom, you're not getting hired. You've been blacklisted. All right, injunctions. Court orders that usually favored management over workers. They stopped workers from striking, which is kind of strange, right? Because we have like freedom of speech, freedom of association. We can choose to work where we want to. Well, here's the crazy thing. If a union goes on strike, and let's say it's something that's essential, especially during wartime, like trains. If a train workers union went on strike in the middle of a wartime effort, well, guess what? How are you going to get stuff from place to place? Automobiles aren't big yet, so the government might come in and say, yeah, we're breaking up this strike. You have to go back to work, which is a very strange situation. But it can happen, and it does. The most recent one that I can think of was the air traffic controller strike. It happened in the 20th century, and basically the air traffic controllers said, we're not making enough money, so we're going on strike. They went on strike, and when air traffic controllers go on strike, you can't fly planes in an era where you have to be able to travel by plane. You ship by plane. Commerce takes place by plane. The courts then enjoined or gave an injunction in favor of management saying, air traffic controllers, you have to go back to work. There's a national security reason for this. There is a national interest in this. If you don't go back to work, our economy can fall apart. We don't want our economy to fall apart because one very, 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 very small subgroup of employees or laborers feel like they need to go on strike. So there are certain times. So like rail workers unions would have their strikes busted up sometimes. Coal workers have had their strikes busted up, and air traffic controllers recently have had their strikes busted up in the national interest. And usually these injunctions did favor management. All right, so the Great Strike in 1877. So this is the tail end of what we call Reconstruction you would have learned about in US 1. This is West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. It was a strike by railroad workers, and it was put down by federal troops. As in, they had to send the army in to stop it. Because what they would do, they wouldn't just strike and say, don't treat us so bad and pick it outside. They'd sit there at the railroad works and just not move. So they couldn't even get replacements in there for them. So Rutherford B. Hayes sent in a bunch of troops to break up the strike and get the railroads working again. It was all, and this whole issue with the railroads being brought down and being stopped for a period of time actually caused a national economic slump. Not a panic or a depression, but it actually did have measurable effects on the economy in a very negative way, which is one of the reasons why it was broken up by federal troops. There's an image of it. So you got the railroad workers on the right-hand side, all angry, and you got federal troops that are basically making it so the railroad cars can travel. Because what the people were doing were just standing on the tracks and not letting railroad cars get through, and that was just stopping trade and the economy across state lines and everything else. It was just hurting the economy because trains were the essential way that we got places from point A to point B. All right, so now we're talking about the Homestead Strike. This is in 1892, so this is before the turn of the century. It was a strike of steel workers, and it was put down once again by federal troops, in part because steel was essential to the U.S. economy, and also because strikes during this time period weren't just like picketing at the gates. Often they'd be picketing inside the factory, so you couldn't get any work done. The strike was massive, so it was a big strike, first of all, and it was well organized. This was kind of new. The previous strike we discussed relating to railroad workers in the late, just after Reconstruction in the 1870s, that was more organic. It kind of just popped up, and people kind of joined on and bandwagon. This one, they knew they were going to strike before they started. Like it was a very organized situation here, and the resulting conflict between the strikers, the scabs coming in to replace them, and the Pinkertons, who were basically hired security guards. They were like, it was a nasty situation because Pinkertons during this time, you'll see a picture of them right here in just a second. They were armed guards, like, and most of them were former soldiers, and they would shoot you. It wasn't like if you threw a rock at them, they'd shoot you with a rifle. I mean, isn't like security guards, even police forces today. When there's a riot and there's rocks being thrown, they just stick their shields up and hold the line. These guys would say, "All right, they threw a rock at us, shoot the next one that throws a rock," and that's how they handled their business. It was a very violent period in history, and there wasn't much regulation on these guys. These guys were just former military, knew what they were doing. The guys that were in charge of them were also former military. They knew what they were doing as far as how to shoot and kill people and basically run what onto a military operation, but in the context of breaking up strikes of American citizens. So it was like using guns on American citizens had a very negative view publicly. And then you have the Haymarket Riot of 1886. This is before the Pullman strike. So I'm sorry, not Pullman strike, the steel strike. You're talking about a strike not so much against a group, it's more like a protest against how the police are treating citizens inside of Chicago. Now, this riot resulted in a firebomb going off and 7 police officers being killed. This basically killed the local labor union, which was known as the Knights of Labor. Essentially, it made the public view unionizing as a radical movement. So if you were a member of a union after the Haymarket riot, it was like, oh, you're one of those radicals. It wasn't like, oh, you're a member of a union, cool, better wages. It was like, oh man, you're a unionist, you're like a socialist, you're going to try to overthrow government and blow things up. And that image came from the Haymarket riot. There's a very famous cartoon of it. Not really cartoon, it's more just like an artist rendition. But this is like the firebomb going off, people shooting each other. This is what people began to associate with a union. A union is a radical, terrible thing that can result in violence. All right, so now we're on to the Pullman strike. This strike was put down by federal troops. So again, anytime you're talking about a major industry in the country, whether it's railways, steel, oil, whatever, if it's a major industry in the U.S., if you go on strike, you're damaging the U.S. economy. And if you damage it too much, the feds are going to side with the management, with the people who are in charge of management in the factory to put down the strike, especially when you do what strikes did during this time period and block people from coming into work and also just kind of just camping out in the factory. That was fairly common. They'd come in, they wouldn't just stand at the fences, they'd go inside the factory or inside the railway and just sit there and like block up traffic and make it so stuff couldn't happen and the economy would drop noticeably when these folks went on strike. Now, the Pullman Company here, what they did was they made sleeping cars for trains. And train was the primary means of travel for at least the somewhat wealthy to get from point A to point B over any great distance. Otherwise, you're talking about walking or riding coach and carriage, which can be very time-consuming and takes a lot longer. Here's some Pullman Company town houses. This is their artist rendition of the strike. And notice, it's not like they're at a fence line just outside the factory. These strikers are like on the railway. They could block what you're doing and make it really hard to get the work done. And then you see the federal troops here, all over the train, pointing guns at people, trying to get them to just stop striking and stop obstructing the train movement. Throughout history, you're going to notice that anytime you have federal troops shooting at American citizens, the perception is almost always negative. All right, so now we're on to big city politics. And to understand this, you need to understand that with industrialization, you also see the industrialization of other ancillary things. So we talk about like the Revolutionary War, low casualties, low death rates, and now we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Well, guess what happened to warfare? It got more efficient, more deadly. Think like the Civil War was the first American industrialized war. We lost more Americans in that war than all other previous wars combined because even the violence, even the method of killing, the method of shooting was industrialized. This is the beginning of the machine gun era with the Gatling gun being invented at the tail end of the Civil War. You start seeing more guns come up as we reach into the turn of the century and we get into World War I. The same thing, that same mechanization, that same speed and efficiency output is placed in the politics as well. And the negative of that is what we call the political machine. A political machine is an organization that basically allows for certain politicians to obtain and, more importantly, maintain control of a group of voters, and therefore they control the city, state, and sometimes have major influence on the national government. So and this would take the form of graft and contracts, and we'll talk about them in just a minute. The most famous leader of the political machines during this time period is a guy named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was very famous for this quote down at the bottom: "As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it?" So basically he's saying as long as he's the vote counter, my side's going to win. This is a real picture of him, not just a political cartoon. He was the leader of the Tammany Hall political machine. This is the Democratic political machine that controlled New York City from basically the Civil War all the way up until the 1940s, and really they had some influence all the way to the 60s. And there's the Tammany Tiger as put forth by Dr. Seuss in 1941. But the more famous idea of the Tammany Hall Tiger was exposed by a guy named Nast. He was the cartoonist who drew the very famous Tammany Hall Tiger. Now, Thomas Nast, he was a very famous cartoonist, and he kind of assigned the animal representations of various political parties. For Tammany Hall, it was the Tammany Tiger, and that wasn't a positive. Like the tiger was meant to be vicious and terrible. And then you also have the donkey and elephant was also Nast's kind of invention. He's credited with kind of associating the donkey with Democrats and the elephant with Republicans. So here's the Tammany Tiger, and take a look at what this looks like. This is a gladiatorial arena from like ancient Rome, so this is all very violent and terrible. Up at the top, look at that guy, Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed's the emperor, and his tiger is killing people, and in particular this one lady down here who's been maimed and murdered by a tiger. She's got a sword, she's got this crown you see over here, what looks to be another crown, but they're all women. It's the idea of Lady Liberty. This is liberty being destroyed, or democracy in this case being destroyed by the Tammany Tiger and the corruption of the political machine that was Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall. And here's some more Thomas Nast. You got the GOP versus the Democrats, and this is where that elephant and donkey animal association comes from. And there's Thomas Nast as he actually existed, and there's his version of Santa Claus. So don't think that Thomas Nast was just some guy that always just drew animals and politics. He also did other stuff like draw a rendition of Santa Claus. It looks a lot like how our interpretation of Santa is. All right, so the way that people like Boss Tweed and other people in charge of various political machines, there was political machines in Chicago and on the West Coast as well, and in other cities in the Northeast, was through graft, the idea of pocketing excess public funds for personal use. This was a tool for corruption. Basically, and it could take the form of a bribe, it could take the form of a government contract being given to somebody who doesn't really need it. Essentially, let's say Boss Tweed is in charge of the New York City political machine. In order to keep his party in power, he might say, all right, I got 10 grand extra in this budget. Instead of saving that for the next fiscal year to be used for public services, he would take that money and give a weak, useless contract to a buddy. And that buddy would then use that money in part to get Tammany Hall's or Boss Tweed's guy reelected. And it would just continue the cycle of corruption. And as the tax money came in and the voter rolls came in, they'd keep their power and they'd keep the excess money. And over and over again, they just keep getting elected. And that's why this same political machine has stayed in power for decades at a time. Trip, I'm giving a lecture right now. No, not right now, buddy. No. I can't watch, okay? I'm doing a recording. I can't watch. Trip. I'm working. Go. Trip. Go. I know. I see the shark. You got to go downstairs. Yeah, I know. Trip. I'm doing work right now. You have to go downstairs. Okay. I see. Go. Thank you. And I'll come and look at it in just a second. Okay, buddy. I see, buddy. Go on. Leave, Trip. Please. You're messing up my recording. Oh, all right. Trip, you need to walk out of here, buddy. Turn it down. All right, so here's two political cartoons. Now, the reason why graft was so negative, outside of the fact that it leads to corruption, it also makes it very hard to prevent corruption, because it wasn't like Boss Tweed was just giving this one guy some money to do what he wanted. Money was changing hands from the top to the bottom. Like, everybody had their hands dirty. So at this bottom cartoon, you notice they're all pointing their finger at somebody else. Well, that's because they can. Even with this little guy down here, there's an Irish person right there, a racist way to show an Irish person. All the way around, all these people, they just have different people. They have money that's changed hands. It's all corrupt, and they just keep pointing the finger to somebody else. Made it very difficult to solve these corruption issues. All right, guys, so now we're talking about the assassination of James Garfield. So he is the president during the early part of the 1880s, and essentially he's only off for 4 months before he's assassinated. Now, he's the second president in U.S. history assassinated, and he's also the second president in less than 20 years to be assassinated. So we're like averaging less than one president every 10 years. Not very good rate here. Lincoln was assassinated for political issues related to John Wilkes Booth's Southern sympathies and dislike of African Americans, and his belief that Lincoln freed them inappropriately and all that stuff. Racist / Southern sympathizing views, very political in nature. Well, James Garfield, his death becomes a catalyst for civil service reform. Now, the reason why it becomes a catalyst is because the guy that shot him didn't shoot him for some major political reason. Charles Cateau, the assassin, actually killed Garfield because he didn't give him a job he wanted. That's why. Because the man didn't get a job, he said, well, I'm going to go kill the president because he didn't give me the job that I thought I should get. Kind of petty. But here's the reason why it's a catalyst. Early on in U.S. history, and really for the first really break it down, nearly half of U.S. history, if you help the president get elected, he'd give you a job. That's how it worked. So we start seeing this negative impact. Well, maybe Guiteau thought he helped the president get elected. Why didn't I get a job? So he chooses to then shoot the president because he didn't get the job he wanted. Not a good plan. It also led to a lot of things like patronage-rooted jobs and a lot of what we called graft. Remember we went over the term graft before? A lot of corruption, a lot of nastiness related to basically government contracts being given to people who shouldn't have them, using the government to make money for people. All very corrupt, very negative stuff. Now you might be asking, all right, so Lincoln was shot and killed. Why wasn't there somebody protecting Garfield? Well, there might have been a couple bodyguards, but for the most part, people think, okay, protects the president, Secret Service. The Secret Service did not have the job of protecting the president until 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley. So at that point, when McKinley is assassinated, that is 3 presidents in 35 years. Not a good rate to be going with. So by the time McKinley gets shot and assassinated, then they were like, okay, we got to give someone the job of protecting the president, make that their main job. So the Secret Service still existed prior, but their only real job was making sure that counterfeiting didn't happen. After 1901, now the Secret Service has the role of also protecting the president, and that has become their primary role at this point. And this is Charles Guiteau. And look at the little cartoon on the other side. It says, an office or your life. Basically, he wants to have a political office because political jobs are steady, they make good money, and they can enable you to use that connection to further money and power after you leave office. And he's dancing on law and order. So basically he's saying, because of my ability to get a job was hampered, I'm going to kill the president. So law and order is destroyed by this idea that people expect to get jobs for basically helping someone get elected. Very negative, corrupt practice, and it just went on for decades in our history. All right. The impact of law and court decisions. So the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883. So we're 2 years after Garfield's been assassinated. This is an attempt to end the patronage, or sometimes called the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils. Now, it then establishes a merit-based system where obtaining jobs is based on standardized testing and basic qualifications. It created a very strange shift in supporting mechanisms. So now, after the Pendleton Act's put in place, helping someone get a job isn't going to get you elected. So what do? You're not going to get the job anymore. So so you might not benefit from helping someone get elected anymore. So the new way you benefit from helping someone get elected is preference when they're in office. So this is when big business interests start donating lots and lots of money to campaigns. This is when that kind of starts up because big businesses are saying, well, I can't get my guys in the office, but what I can do is give them money so that when they do get in office, they feel like they owe me, and maybe I can get more support when they're in office that way. And this is a cartoon at the time called The True Meaning of Republican Harmony. So the Republican Party at the time. This is the party of Lincoln. So this is various members of the Republican Party at the time who were slaughtering the civil service reformed lamb underneath the altar of patronage with the spoils trident above it. So basically they're saying we're going to slaughter this lamb so we can still have all the things we like with patronage. Weren't big fans of it. All right, so this is the name of the Pendleton Act. So this is Senator George Hunt Pendleton, so Pendleton's civil service, and there's President Chester A. Arthur. All right, so Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This is an attempt by the government to stifle trusts, as in basically break up monopolies, so there would be more competition. Now, early on in this court, most cases were dismissed or the defendant was found not guilty, which means the monopolies got to keep going. So it wasn't a very effective law, although it is later changed and becomes more effective as time goes on. And the Sherman Antitrust Act, I believe, is still on the books today in some form. All right, so this one is called Bosses of the Senate. So the Senate, we elect them. They take care of us. They're the ones that are supposed to actually pass laws. They're the upper house. Well, who's really in charge in this picture? The Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, the Standard Oil Trust, all these various trusts or monopolies who have this donating power. They're putting business interests before the interests of the United States people that vote them in office. That's the idea of this cartoon. All right, now we got to deal with government corruption. So during this time period, from 1877 really to 1910, you start seeing more and more corruption getting exposed. So the whiskey ring was just a bribery scandal during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. That's in the late 1870s. You can look at this cartoon real fast. It's not super important. It's actually, we cover this in US 1 mostly. Then we have the concept of laissez-faire, meaning hands-off. This is an economic term that was used basically saying that the government should not interfere with free market business, and that the laws of the free market and the cycle of the free market would fix any problems in the economy. It was heavily favored by Gilded Age businessmen like Rockefeller and Carnegie because it meant the government did not interfere with their businesses. Now, in reality, laissez-faire doesn't really work. Here's the theory of laissez-faire. Companies X, Y, and Z all sell the same product. Companies X and Y start selling a very inferior product, as in it's not very good. So then you go to company Z. That's how you solve that problem. And then company X and Y, in response, make their product better, and they become more equal. All right, so now you have X, Y, and Z, and they're making equal product at equal price. They're selling something for $5 each. So in order to get an edge, company Z says, well, I'm going to lower my price to $4 to sell more stuff. So all of a sudden, now you have a higher quality product being sold for less due to competition. That's laissez-faire in theory. Now, here's what happens in practice. So pretend you're Rockefeller. All right, companies X, Rockefeller owns company X, but there's also Y and Z. So Rockefeller has two choices: compete with Y and Z, or do what Rockefeller does, which is buy Y, buy Z, and then sell things for whatever he wants to sell them for, because he has all the companies that sell the product. That's the problem with monopolies. That's the problem with laissez-faire economic styles, because it just doesn't happen. Once too much power and money is consolidated into one person, they can just buy up all the competitive elements, and then there's no more competition. There's no reason for a business to make a better product because they have to buy it from you. You're not competing against anyone. All right, another Ulysses S. Grant scandal, the credit mobilier scandal. Now, this involved the railroad. This is essentially a graft scandal where they were given government contracts, but in this case, they were given government contracts and paid a super huge amount of money where they shouldn't have been paid that much. They were basically doing like the very famous case in the 20th century is the $3,000 toilet in the military. Well, the reason why that got caught was because they were basically overcharging for small items to make money and pocket the profits. This same thing was happening here. They were charging way too much on a contract basis to build a railroad, to the point that the owners of the railroad were making a bunch of extra money at the expense of taxpayers. Now, political changes. All right, so initiatives start becoming very popular during this time. So traditionally, legislation is proposed by legislators, people you vote into office who then legislate or make laws for you. An initiative is a progressive political reform that basically let the citizens propose legislation. So if enough citizens sign a petition saying we want X, Y, and Z to be a law, it would go forward, and then they have to debate it, and it would be more accountability. The public would have more of a say. A referendum is also a progressive political reform. Now, in this case, you might have a law that you want to be passed, but rather than having it go through traditional channels of the legislature writes it and then the president vetoes or signs into law, now we're going to let the people decide whether or not it gets turned into law or vetoed. So you'd have like in this case they use school tax as an example, like bond referendums. The most famous one in North Carolina would be the constitutional amendment referendum to ban gay marriage, basically saying, all right, here's the proposed law. Go vote on it, citizens. So as in, you go to the ballot box, you vote on this. If you approve it, it becomes the law. No governor signing, nothing. It just goes straight to the people to sign. And then you have a recall. All right, so here's how recall works. You elect candidate A. 2 years in, candidate A sucks. He's awful. He's a liar. He's a terrible person, yada, yada, yada. Typically, you couldn't do anything about it until his term was up 2 years later. Let's say he's governor or the president. Now, gubernatorial elections or governor elections, you can knock him out early. So, all right, he's terrible. We need to get his butt out of here. Let's vote to get him out. That's what a recall is. That's all it is. Ends the term early. They have a special election to vote in the new guy. So this is Gray Davis. Gray Davis was the governor of California. Was because he was recalled. He was removed from office by a vote of the people of California, and he was replaced by the governor. Arnold Schwarzenegger then ran after Gray Davis was recalled for governor and won. He was Republican governor of California, and he was there for 2 terms. Another progressive or populist movement during this time period was the secret ballot. Early on in American history, ballots could be like in a meeting hall where you raise your hands. Like it could be that open in public. This was a way to curb fraud and corruption, because guess what? You might have somebody out there waiting with clubs to come beat the people up that don't vote the right way, quote unquote, the right way. Voter intimidation, fraud, corruption, all these things, people voting twice, was somewhat eliminated by secret balloting, which today is just totally normal. And then we have the movement called populism, also, and we call people who are in favor of populism, we call them populists. And the way I want you to remember this is populist, as in populist, L-E-A-S-T, because these people in the populist party and who engaged in love of populism tended to be focused on issues that affected the poorest, least represented, the marginalized people in society, whether it was workers, farmers, whoever. These people tended to be very poor, didn't get a lot from government because they didn't have money to kind of push their beliefs or lobby in a lot of ways or help their own cause by impacting or changing the opinions of government. So this is a rise in the poor coming up to have a bigger impact in politics. And here are the various planks of the Populist Party. Pause it, write them down, look over them, make sure you know like the general idea about them. They basically give a lot more control to the little guy. Populism is all about the little guy. All these various things like secret ballots, referendum, recall, elections, direct primaries, they all benefit the little guy. All right, so Knights of Labor. Now, this is one of the earliest unions. It was active from the 1860s, 1890s, and we talked about it just a brief moment earlier in the lecture. We talked about the Haymarket Riot. Well, early on, this was the big advocate was 8-hour workdays, equal pay for work for men and women, and it was started by a guy named Uriah Stevens. And then later it was led by a guy named Terence Powderly, but the Haymarket Riot basically killed the Knights of Labor. They were active for like 30 years, but they were just destroyed by the Haymarket Riot because public perception of that union just went to the toilet after people were shot and killed and hurt. Now this is my favorite because the word is hilarious. Mugwumps. Mugwumps are reform-minded Republicans who supported Grover Cleveland and the Democrat Party in 1884 over their candidate for president. So this is a weird situation. So Republicans would have voted for a guy named James B. Blaine because they're Republican. But in this case, because these Republicans were more in favor of reform, a lot of them were populist in nature, they voted for Grover Cleveland because his party just happened to be the one that was more populist, and he was much more reform-minded and more progressive. But the name is awesome. Mugwumps is hilarious. All right, so U.S. v. E.C. King Knight Company. This is the Sugar Trust case. So this is a bunch of sugar producers all coming together, and they basically were bought out and became a monopoly, and they stifled competition within the sugar industry. This is a landmark trust busting or monopoly busting case. Now, although it came out in favor of the trust, it became a catalyst for the progressive movement, and it limited the government's power to control monopolies. Basically, here's what happened. So the government loses the case, but this monopoly is in power. That basically ticked people off who were thinking very populist in nature. So they had a thing to fight about now. If they just won the case, then they would probably have been settled down and they could have built back their monopoly later. But because the monopoly won, it ticked people off and kind of united them around some new idea to basically be more progressive and create better laws to end trusts. Now, the progressive movement as a total, the ultimate aim sought reforms in the workplace, society, and in politics. So ending the labor unions, child labor laws, that will be progressive movements. 8-hour workdays, progressive movements. Societal changes, how we treat tenement homes, sanitation movements in the cities, political movements, ending graft, the Pendleton Civil Service Act. All those things relate directly to progressivism and trying to bring us out of this age of pure industrial capitalism into a more government-controlled arena where the little guy, the populist, are kind of taken care of.